So what are we gonna do today, Cousin BW?
The same thing we do every day, Melvin. Try to take over the neighborhood.
Hey y'all, Bloodwing here, back to bring some grumpiness to your internet. I've actually wanted to make this video for a couple of days with Halloween upcoming, and it now is Halloween. In fact, I'm sitting here in my home, all the grandkids are off trick-or-treating, and I wanted to get it done earlier and get it out before Halloween, because there's another video I want to do, and I'm going to try to put it out as well today, so you might get 2 videos from me today. But because of a Twitter conversation I had about old movies, it reminded me of how I got started into horror movies. And I'm a huge horror movie fan. Huge. Now, me being old, of course, most of my favorites are going to be older films. But I'm not averse to some of the newer films. I like some of them. But instead of making this what my favorite movies are, and I'll probably mention a few movies, but that's not what this is about. I want to explain how I even became a horror movie fan. Now, this is something I talked about in a very old video of mine, made almost right after I began in a series, kind of a podcast series I used to do called Grump of the Week, which would be every Friday. But since it's been a while ago, I'm going to talk about it a little bit more today, maybe going into a little bit more detail. And in fact, some of you may know that I have a creepypasta channel, which I haven't uploaded to in a very long time. But my motivation for that was remembering this part of my growing up. And some of you older Americans, I'm not sure if they did this in Europe or not. It's the reason I'm just saying Americans. Maybe they did. But some of you older Americans will remember what I'm talking about. Now, I was born in 1960, which made me a kid throughout the 60s and a teenager in the 70s. Starting in the late 50s into the early 60s, there was a phenomena, and there's nothing else that you can call it but that, a phenomenon. I believe it started on the West Coast, but the phenomena was local radio stations around the country, or TV stations around the country were starting to create their own horror hosts. Now, some of them were very famous, some of them not so much, depending on the size of the market, but every, at least big to medium market, had their own horror hosts, which would, by horror host, I mean they were a character, usually horror-themed character in and of themselves, like a vampire-type character or a ghoul or whatever. And they would host scary movies. And in between, commercial breaks and so forth, they would crack really dumb and corny jokes. So it was a mix of being scary and funny. And here in Indianapolis, where I grew up, it's was not any different. We had our own horror host. His name was Sammy Terry. Get it? Cemetery? Sammy Terry. And he was supposedly a ghoul. And just looking at this picture just brings a smile to my face, because there's so much of my childhood wrapped up around this man and his TV show, which it did move to Saturday nights for a little while, but mostly it was on Friday nights. It would flip back and forth to showing one movie to 2 movies. Remember, back in the days before cable, when there were only 3 major networks, TV stations often went off the air at about midnight. On Friday nights, they stayed on a little longer on Channel 4 because of Sammy Terry, but they would eventually go off the air and not come back on until 6 a.m. And I know that sounds strange to people today, but that's the way it was. But, Sammy Terry. He introduced me to so many old movies. Of course, the old Universal classic monster movies, Frankenstein and Dracula. My favorites were The Wolfman and Creature from the Black Lagoon. I know the Creature gets panned a lot, but he scared the bejesus out of me, those movies. Probably partly for the same reason that Jaws did, because I have this, I wouldn't call it a phobia, but I really don't like swimming in natural bodies of water, lakes, rivers, creeks, the ocean, so forth, because I don't know what's in the water with me. And it's always in the back of my mind. If I'm going to swim, I prefer to do so in a pool. But, yeah, the Creature always got me. And, but there weren't the only kind of movies he showed. Psycho, that type of thing. Old Hammer, the British, movies made of Dracula and Frankenstein and their own monsters. Of course, there were lots of the old American International or United Artists movies, such as I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, and movies like Dementia 13, which is a great old movie, and corny movies that are so bad they're good, like Horror at Party Beach or Attack of the Giant Leeches. And sometimes there were science fiction movies, or as long as it had somewhat to do with being scary or horror, it could appear on Nightmare Theater, which is what they called the TV show that Sammy Terry hosted. But to give you an idea, and Sammy Terry was this host, he come out of a coffin. He had this obviously fake spider named George that would come down and talk to him in a type voice. And they would bounce off one another, telling really corny jokes. But I'm going to give you an idea here, just what I'm talking about. And let's play a quick clip of just one episode of the intro to Nightmare Theater.
Good evening. Welcome to the dungeon that horror built. The home of Sammy Terry. Oh, there are so many ways to have a horrible time. And so many things to have a horrible time with. Things such as a date with a bad breath. That's horrible. A blind date that's built into a superstar dimension and turns out to be a real nerd. That's horrible. A car that won't start. A check that bounces when it isn't even the basketball season. A cold drink in your lap just as you rise to meet someone you want to impress. Those are all horrible. Not to mention the baby's throw up all over the wall. Mascara running in the rain. Hose running in the office when you're sitting still. Oh, but none of these are as horrible as that which I have for you tonight. A legend that goes back to earlier times that will come alive to terrify and haunt you. The archaeologists in Egypt who opened the tombs of the pharaohs suffered their ancient curses. But in Transylvania, not a curse by man, but a curse on the world from the devil will erupt when an ancient tomb is violated, and from its dank and dingy bowels will spring forth Dracula's dog.
Corny, right? But corny in a fun way. So maybe you can see why it was so addictive, and it was a rite of passage. I can remember being in elementary school, 6, 7, 8 years old, and the little boys would get together and did you watch Sammy Tree this week? You know, of course, there was always, oh, my mom wouldn't let me, or no, this, that, and the other. But it was a rite of passage. It was like going to the local haunted house by yourself, if you could sit up. And I can remember so many times of begging my Mom, please let me stay up and watch Sammy Terry tonight. And of course she'd go, you watched it last week and it scared you so bad you had nightmares you ended up in the bed with me. I don't know if I should. Oh, please, Mom. Come on, Mom. Let me. And eventually she would give in because she knew it was harmless. It was well past my regular bedtime, of course. Did not start until 11 o'clock at night. And in those days, I probably went to bed at about 9 at night. But it was a Friday, so it didn't hurt anything. And she knew where I was. I was right there in the next room watching the old black and white TV set. And sure enough, eventually I'd get scared, and more often than not, I'd end up in the bed with Mom because I was having nightmares. But it was such a huge part of my childhood, and it got me so interested in the horror genre. And of course, most of these movies were not bloody by today's standards, probably corny. The special effects weren't as good because they hadn't grown yet to the technology that we have today. But I think it's also the reason that I'm really hard to scare, and it's hard to find, for me, or a horror movie that I really like today, because all too often today, and this is my opinion, yours probably will vary, all too often today, today's horror movies rely far too much on the jump scare. A jump scare here and there in the right place is fine, but too many get stupid. And they rely far too much on just being gory, bloody. Again, I'm not against gore or blood if it's in the right place at the right time and helps further the story. But gore just for the sake of being gross, come on. Let's tell a story. And these old horror movies from the 40s and 50s and 60s and up into the 70s that he would play, the Count Yorga series, and which was vampire movies, but boy, you could really see the influence from the Manson clan in these movies, as with a lot of, and an Incredible Two-Headed Transplant, which was an awful movie, but funny. Some of these movies were scary because they built an aura of suspense and of being scared. And this was my childhood. This is what I grew up with. And he'd done this show for decades until he got so old that he couldn't do it anymore. And now I hear that his son, he's since passed away. And I did have the great fortune of meeting him once when I worked at a car dealership that he'd come in during the Halloween season to make a commercial for. We pulled in an old-fashioned Hearst into the garage, and he done a commercial, and I got to watch him film that. It was a great experience, and shake his hand, and got to meet him without his makeup. And it was just I was such a fanboy, as was every kid of Indianapolis at that time. And like I said, every market had their own horror host. No matter where you lived, you probably can relate. If you're anywhere near my age, you've seen, you know what I'm talking about. They were everywhere. This just happened to be the one in my area. And the kids today miss out on this, I think. The fun that it was, and the rite of passage that it become, and the great old movies that it introduced you to, things that you might not have otherwise been able to see or even thought about seeing. Now, there were some real stinkers, of course, but a lot of them were really great old movies that spanned decades. Like I said, the 50s and 60s and 70s, even in the 40s. And if it was a night we were looking at Dracula or Frankenstein, into the 30s. You know, and as time went on, they started showing newer and newer movies up into the 70s, like Hush Hush, Sweet Charlotte. And it was just a really fun time to be alive and to experience. And this is why I love horror movies today, because it meant so much to me as a kid. You know, I remember one time when, I was about 10 years old. And Mom and Dad were going to be gone for the weekend, and my 15-year-old cousin came over to babysit us. Well, now she's only 5 years older than me, but, 10, 15, there's a big difference. And it was a Friday night, and I wanted to watch Nightmare Theater, and she just fought me and fought me and fought me. I finally said, look, Mom and Dad let me watch this show. And she just didn't want to watch, and I found out the reason was because it scared her. She couldn't stand it, but yet she felt like since she was babysitting, she had to sit up with me to watch the show. And she was so scared by the time that it was over. Oh, the memories and the good times. But this is why I am so fascinated by horror movies, especially the old classic horror movies. It just means so much to me. It was such a huge part of my childhood that it's something I doubt I will ever grow out of and that I will ever forget. But anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. And, this is different content. I'm not going after the SJWs today. It's just my way of saying Happy Halloween and sharing a little bit about myself with you. As I said, stay tuned. I think I'm going to have another video ready for you, and hope that you enjoy it with maybe some stories to get you in the Halloween mood tonight for you to listen to when all the lights are off. But anyway, as always, get out of my yard.